In 1999, one country controlled 38% of global military spending, anchored 62% of the world's currency reserves, and won nearly every trade dispute it filed. The international system wasn't just stable. It was engineered around a single center of gravity. But the dominance didn't collapse overnight. It eroded lever by lever, triggering a chain reaction most people still misread as chaos. What happens when the architecture holding the world together loses its grip? Not suddenly, but structurally. The real turning point isn't the crisis most people point to. By the end of this, you'll see that the global order isn't breaking. It's rebalancing, without rules, without a referee, and that may be far more dangerous. By the early 1990s, global commerce was accelerating at a pace the world had never seen. As the Soviet Union dissolved and trade barriers fell, countries from Eastern Europe to East Asia rushed to join the new system. The World Bank's data shows that between 1990 and 1999, the share of world trade in global GDP jumped from about 30% to over 45%. This wasn't just a statistical blip. It was a structural transformation driven by a belief that open markets and free movement of goods would anchor international stability. The so-called Washington Consensus became the playbook. Governments slashed tariffs, privatized industries, and signed on to new trade agreements. The World Trade Organization, launched in 1995, quickly grew to include economies that had once been behind the Iron Curtain. Walmart, for example, opened its first stores in Canada in 1994 and was operating in China by 2001. American and European firms poured investment into emerging markets, expecting that commercial ties would reduce the risk of conflict and give everyone a stake in the system. Trade integration wasn't just about economics. It became a pillar of the post-Cold War order, linking far-flung economies through complex supply chains and shared rules. The logic was simple. The more countries depended on global trade, the less likely they were to challenge the system that made it possible. Multilateral institutions like the WTO, IMF, and World Bank enforce these rules, resolving disputes and encouraging countries to play by the same standards. For a while, this approach seemed to work. Most nations saw steady growth, and the number of people living in extreme poverty fell dramatically during the 1990s and the early 2000s. But the very openness that fueled this boom also created new vulnerabilities. As supply chains stretched across continents, disruptions in one region could ripple worldwide. The assumption that economic ties would guarantee order was never tested on a global scale until new pressures began to surface. The next act in this story asks, what happens when the system that once promised stability starts to reveal its limits? The post-Cold War order rested on more than just booming trade. Two other pillars, military reach and financial supremacy, made the system feel unshakable. The United States maintained a military presence that spanned the globe, with over 40 overseas bases and formal security guarantees to 25 countries. By the late 1990s, United States defense spending accounted for about 38% of all military outlays worldwide, a proportion that held steady into the 2020s. This level of force projection was not just about fighting wars. It was about deterring rivals and reassuring allies that the rules would be enforced, if necessary, by overwhelming power. But hard power alone did not keep the system stable. The United States dollar became the world financial backbone. Central banks from Tokyo to Brasilia held their reserves in United States dollars. By 2023, the dollar made up about 62% of global foreign exchange reserves, according to the International Monetary Fund. The deep, liquid United States Treasury market allowed governments and investors to park their money in what was seen as the safest asset on Earth. When crises hit, whether the Asian financial panic in 1997 or the global meltdown in 2008, capital flooded into United States treasuries, reinforcing the dollar's dominance. Nearly every major cross-border transaction flowed through dollar clearing systems, with over 90% of international payments routed via SWIFT, using the greenback as the settlement currency. This financial leverage gave Washington the ability to sanction adversaries, stabilize markets, or inject liquidity in ways no other country could match. The combination of military muscle and monetary authority created a system where rule-shias had teeth and where breaking them carried real consequences. Contrast this with other periods in history. In the 1970s, the United States faced stagflation and a weakened dollar, but it did not have the same global network of alliances or the same tight grip on financial plumbing. The post-1991 order was different because it fused security and finance, making both the stick and the carrot run through Washington. This dual structure, the Pentagon's reach and the Treasury's depth, underwrote the sense of predictability that defined the era. But as new players gained strength and alternative networks began to form, the stability these pillars provided started to look less permanent. The next challenge was not just about who set the rules, but whether those rules would still be enforceable if the pillars themselves began to erode. International order depends on more than military alliances or financial dominance. It also requires a set of shared rules, clear, enforceable standards that govern how countries interact, settle disputes, and resolve crises without resorting to force. After 1991, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund became the architects of this legal framework. Their charters and treaties codified everything from trade tariffs to sovereign debt workouts, aiming to make the global system predictable and, at least on paper, fair. The World Trade Organization, in particular, played a key role in this architecture. Its dispute settlement mechanism allowed member states to challenge each other over trade barriers and subsidies, with formal panels issuing binding rulings. Between 2000 and 2020, WTO data shows that United States complainants won 62% of their cases. This high success rate reflected not just legal merit, but also the alignment of institutional procedures with American trade interests. The IMF, meanwhile, gave the United States a voting share of nearly 17%, enough to block major reforms. These numbers reveal how the rules-based system was never fully neutral. It was built to reinforce the interests of the most powerful players while still offering smaller countries a path to resolve grievances through established channels. The United Nations Security Council functioned as the ultimate backstop for international peace and security, but its structure also favored the victors of World War II. The 5 permanent members, each with veto power, could prevent any action that threatened their core interests. In practice, this meant that enforcement of global norms often depended on consensus among a handful of states, especially the United States and its closest allies. For a time, this institutional consolidation delivered real benefits. Trade disputes were settled without resorting to embargoes or blockades. Financial crises were managed through coordinated IMF programs rather than competitive devaluations or capital controls. Even when tensions ran high, the existence of formal rules and dispute panels gave governments a way to back down without losing face. This predictability became the hidden infrastructure of globalization, giving investors and policymakers the confidence to plan years ahead. But the system's apparent fairness masked deep imbalances. The dominance of United States interests in WTO rulings and IMF decisions raised questions about whose rules were actually being enforced. As new powers grew more assertive, and as compliance with institutional decisions became more selective, the system's ability to deliver stability began to fray. The next phase of the story asks, what happens when the rules themselves start to lose their authority? In December 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. This decision did not just open new markets, it triggered one of the largest shifts in global economic power in modern history. Factories across China began producing everything from electronics and machinery to clothing and toys, feeding a surge in exports that would reshape global supply chains. Between 2001 and 2010, China's share of world merchandise exports more than tripled, climbing from just under 4% to nearly 11%, according to World Trade Organization records. By 2023, that figure reached over 15%, making China the world's largest exporter by a significant margin. The numbers tell the story. In 2001, China exported about $266 billion worth of goods. A decade later, that number stood at $1.6 trillion. Factories clustered in coastal provinces like Guangdong and Zhejiang became the backbone of global manufacturing. Multinational companies from Apple to Adidas shifted production to China to take advantage of lower costs and unmatched scale. This concentration of manufacturing power created a new kind of leverage, one based not on military force or financial flows, but on the ability to supply the world with essential goods and components. The consequences extended far beyond trade statistics. As supply chains became more complex and tightly integrated with Chinese production, countries around the world grew increasingly dependent on a single hub for everything from smartphones to medical equipment. When a disruption hit, whether a labor strike, a power shortage, or later a pandemic, the effects rippled across continents. This new form of interdependence carried risks that few policymakers fully anticipated at the time. Why does this matter? The rise of China as a manufacturing powerhouse changed the balance of economic power. It gave Beijing tools to influence global markets, shape pricing, and when necessary, restrict access to critical goods. What looked like a win-win for global efficiency also concentrated vulnerability in ways that would only become clear years later. As the story unfolds, the world will discover just how much leverage can come from controlling the supply side of the global economy. August 2008. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, a major power crossed an internationally recognized border by force in Europe. Russian troops rolled into Georgia, launching a 5-day conflict that would test the credibility of the post-1991 order. The fighting began with an assault in South Ossetia, a breakaway region where Russian-backed separatists had clashed with Georgian forces for years. As Georgian troops moved to reassert control, Moscow answered with overwhelming military power, columns of tanks, airstrikes, and naval blockades. Within days, Russian forces advanced deep into Georgian territory, reaching the outskirts of Gori, a city just 60 kilometers from the capital, Tbilisi. The speed and scale of the intervention caught Western governments off guard. The United States and the European Union condemned the incursion, but stopped short of any direct military response. Instead, they pushed for a negotiated ceasefire, brokered by the French presidency of the European Union. On August 12, 2008, both sides agreed to halt hostilities, but Russian troops remained in control of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, solidifying their presence with new military bases and border posts. In the immediate aftermath, nearly 200,000 civilians were displaced, and hundreds of soldiers and civilians lost their lives. The war's human cost underscored the risks of unresolved territorial disputes in the post-Soviet space. Diplomatically, the war sent shockwaves through international institutions. The UN Security Council met in emergency session, but failed to produce a unified response, stymied by Russian veto power. NATO, which had previously discussed a path toward membership for Georgia, suspended talks and adopted a more cautious posture. For Moscow, the conflict was a calculated test of how far it could push against the boundaries of the United States-led security system without triggering direct confrontation. For Washington and its allies, the episode exposed the limits of influence in regions where security guarantees were ambiguous. The 2008 war did not redraw borders on a global scale, but it shattered the illusion that the post-Cold War order was immune to military challenge. Russia's use of force, limited but decisive, set a precedent that would echo in later crises. The world now faced a new reality. Regional powers were willing to test the system, and the consequences of inaction or indecision could reverberate far beyond the battlefield. In February 2014, Russian forces moved into Crimea, seizing government buildings and key infrastructure in a matter of days. Within 3 weeks, a disputed referendum was held, and Moscow declared Crimea part of the Russian Federation. This was the first time since World War II that a European border was redrawn by force, breaking the post-Cold War assumption that territorial integrity in Europe was untouchable. The immediate fallout was swift. The United States and the European Union imposed targeted sanctions on Russian officials and state-linked companies. These measures froze assets, restricted access to Western financial markets, and banned travel for dozens of individuals. Over the next year, the sanctions expanded to cover entire sectors, including energy, banking, and defense. Russian gross domestic product growth, already slowing, dipped into negative territory by 2015. But the penalties did not reverse the annexation. Instead, they pushed Russia to deepen economic ties with China and seek alternatives to dollar-based finance. NATO, for its part, responded with a dramatic shift in posture. In June 2014, the alliance announced the launch of the Enhanced Forward Presence, stationing multinational battle groups in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. By 2017, over 4,500 troops from the UK, Germany, Canada, and the US were deployed on a rotational basis, backed by rapid reaction forces and regular air patrols. For the first time since the 1990s, Western tanks and armored vehicles returned to the eastern edge of Europe. The message was clear: any further incursion would trigger a collective response. This escalation did not restore the old order. Instead, it set off a new cycle of distrust and military buildup. Russia strengthened its grip on Crimea, fortified its Black Sea fleet, and supported separatist movements in eastern Ukraine. The European Union and NATO, once focused on economic integration, now shifted resources toward deterrence and defense. The lines had been redrawn, both on the map and in the minds of policymakers across the continent. What began as a regional crisis became a structural rift, foreshadowing the larger confrontation that would erupt years later. The monopoly of Western-led financial institutions is no longer absolute. In 2016, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank began operations with 57 founding members. Within 8 years, its membership grew to 110 countries, spanning Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America. The AIB has already approved over 45 billion euros in projects, funding roads, energy grids, and ports from Indonesia to Egypt. Its stated mission is to promote sustainable infrastructure, but its real impact is to offer governments an alternative to the World Bank and the IMF, no longer forcing them to accept Western conditions as the price of capital. A parallel story is unfolding with the new development bank, the BRICS Bank. Launched in 2015 by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the NDB now includes 21 members and has authorized capital of $100 billion. By 2024, it had approved more than $30 billion in loans and guarantees, much of it directed toward renewable energy and public transport in member states. Both the AIIB and the NDB are now co-financing projects with each other and with local development banks, building a web of financial flows that bypasses traditional Western oversight. These institutions are not just symbolic. For countries facing Western sanctions or seeking to avoid dollar-based scrutiny, they offer a lifeline. Russia, Iran, and others have used parallel payment systems and non-dollar loans to keep trade moving, even when cut off from SWIFT or US banks. The AIIB and the NDB have also begun experimenting with local currency settlements, further eroding the dollar's dominance in cross-border finance. Why does this matter? The rise of these banks means that the world's financial plumbing is becoming more fragmented. When a country can turn to Beijing or Sao Paulo instead of Washington or Brussels, Western leverage over economic behavior weakens. The rules of the game are no longer written in one place. Instead, multiple centers of power are now shaping how money moves, who gets access to credit, and under what terms. This rebalancing of financial authority is still gathering pace, and the consequences are only beginning to play out. What happens when the next crisis hits and there is no single referee to coordinate the response? On February 24, 2022, Russian forces crossed into Ukraine on multiple fronts. The scale and speed of the assault caught European governments off guard. Within days, images of burning cities and fleeing civilians dominated headlines, but the deeper shock came in defense ministries from Berlin to Helsinki. For decades, Europe had assumed that large-scale war on the continent was a thing of the past. Suddenly, that assumption collapsed. NATO's first response was immediate. Emergency meetings, activation of defense plans, and the deployment of additional battle groups to the eastern flank. Within 6 weeks, NATO had stationed a new multinational force in Finland and doubled air defense patrols over the Baltic states. Public opinion shifted quickly. Eurobarometer surveys in 2023 showed nearly 70% of Europeans now viewed United States security guarantees as essential, up from barely half before the invasion. The biggest changes came in national budgets. In the 12 months after the invasion, European defense spending jumped by 28%, rising from 1.02 trillion euros to 1.31 trillion euros. 14 NATO members now meet or exceed the 2% of gross domestic product target, up from just 6 before the war. Germany, once reluctant, announced a 100 billion euro fund to overhaul its military, while France and Italy committed to joint missile programs and new air defense systems. But the rush to rearm exposed a critical weakness: ammunition. NATO's stockpiles of 155mm artillery shells, essential for Ukraine's defense, fell from 110,000 rounds in 2021 to just 65,000 by 2024. The European Ammunition Initiative, launched in 2023, set a goal of producing 500,000 rounds annually by 2027, but factories struggled to keep up with battlefield demand. This rapid militarization wasn't just about weapons. It forced governments to rethink supply chains, industrial policy, and alliances. Joint procurement projects multiplied, and the European Union set up a 150 billion euro defense fund to support research and production. The result? Europe's security order is now defined by urgency, coordination, and a new willingness to spend. But as defense budgets soared, so did questions about energy security and economic resilience, issues that would soon test the limits of Europe's transformation. Roughly 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil traded by sea passes through the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway, just 21 miles across at its tightest point, connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. The International Energy Agency estimates that on average about 20% of the world's daily oil consumption, nearly 21 million barrels, moves through these waters each day. The stakes are clear. Any disruption here sends shockwaves across global energy markets. Iran sits directly on the northern shore. Over the past decade, it has turned geography into leverage. Tanker tracking data and incident logs show a pattern. When tensions rise, so do the risks. In 2019, Iranian forces seized the British-flagged Stena Impero and detained its crew for weeks. Insurance rates for vessels in the region spiked by as much as 400% overnight, and spot oil prices jumped nearly 10% in a single trading session. The message was unmistakable. Shipping through Hormuz is never guaranteed safe passage. This is not just a story about military posturing. The threat of mines, missile attacks, or ship seizures gives Iran a powerful bargaining chip, especially when sanctions tighten or diplomatic talks stall. Even rumors of a closure are enough to force energy importers in Asia and Europe to seek alternative routes or pay a premium for secure cargoes. The fragility of this choke point highlights a broader reality. Global energy flows depend on a handful of vulnerable arteries, and the actors who control them can shape markets far beyond their borders. The world's reliance on Hormuz is a reminder that economic power and geopolitical risk are tightly linked. As new flashpoints emerge, the ability to disrupt or guarantee energy supplies becomes a central feature of the new, more contested world order. March 2021. The container ship Evasion ran aground in the Suez Canal, blocking one of the most important arteries of global trade for 6 days. Nearly 12% of all world trade moves through this narrow waterway, connecting Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. When the Evasion became lodged sideways, over 400 ships piled up at both ends, unable to move. The World Shipping Council estimated that global trade lost $9.6 billion every day the canal was blocked. That is about $400 million per hour. Goods, fuel, and components were stuck in limbo. From Shanghai to Rotterdam, shipping companies scrambled for alternatives. Some vessels rerouted thousands of miles around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, adding up to 2 weeks to their journeys and driving up costs. Insurance premiums soared, Delays rippled through supply chains, stranding everything from electronics to livestock. For a brief moment, a single ship accident exposed how much the world depends on a handful of physical choke points. The Suez Canal is just one example, but its blockage forced governments and companies to confront a hard truth: efficiency comes with risk, and the margin for error is razor thin. Why does this incident matter? It is not just about a stranded ship. The Ever Given showed that even in a high-tech, globally connected world, a single point of failure can freeze billions of dollars in trade overnight. As supply networks grow more complex, the consequences of disruption multiply. The next question is, what happens when these choke points become targets, or when actors deliberately exploit them to shift the balance of power? In the mid-2020s, a new layer of complexity entered the global energy market. As Western sanctions tightened on Russia and Iran, the official flow of oil hit a wall. But the barrels did not disappear. They simply changed course. Commodities traders, facing blocked routes and frozen assets, turned to ship-to-ship transfers at sea. In these operations, crude is pumped from one tanker to another, often just outside territorial waters, then relabeled and sent on to buyers willing to look the other way. Kepler, a leading maritime analytics firm, tracked a surge in these transfers. By 2023, more than 420 million tons of crude changed hands this way, a 7% jump from the year before. Flag swaps and shell companies became standard tools. A Russian-flagged vessel might transfer its cargo to a Liberian-registered tanker, which then sails to Asia under a new name. These maneuvers blur the origin of the oil and let sanctioned producers reach markets in China, India, and beyond, often at a steep discount. The price gap between sanctioned and official grades widened to as much as $25 per barrel in some months, creating a two-tier market that rewards those able to navigate the risks. Secondary buyers, smaller refiners, energy brokers, and sometimes state-backed firms step in to absorb these discounted shipments. For them, the calculation is simple. Cheaper oil offsets the risk of regulatory backlash. The global market fragments further as more trade flows outside traditional channels, weakening the impact of sanctions and making enforcement harder with each passing month. This system does not just move oil, it shifts leverage. The more energy flows through informal routes, the less control traditional powers have over supply and pricing. The next question is how these shadow networks will interact with the world's strategic choke points, where geography and power collide. In the far north, a new trade corridor is quietly redrawing the world's shipping map. As Arctic sea ice retreats at a rate of about 3% per decade, the northern sea route has gone from a seasonal curiosity to a serious alternative for moving goods between Asia and Europe. Automatic identification system data, tracked by the Arctic Council, reveals a staggering 230% increase in vessel traffic through this passage from 2015 to 2024. For shipping planners, these numbers are more than a trend. They are a signal that the Arctic is open for business in ways it never was before. The appeal is simple. The Northern Sea Route can cut the distance between Shanghai and Rotterdam by up to 40% compared to the Suez Canal. For container lines and bulk carriers, that means shorter voyages, Suez, lower fuel costs, and fewer bottlenecks. But there is a catch. The window for safe passage is still limited by ice conditions. Most transits happen between July and October, when the sea lanes are clearest. Even so, the surge in traffic has prompted major shipping firms to invest in ice-class vessels and to develop real-time navigation systems tailored for Arctic conditions. This is not just about moving cargo faster. Each new ship that makes the journey signals a shift in the geography of global trade. As routes multiply, the old choke points, Suez, Hormuz, and Malacca, lose some of their stranglehold on the flow of goods. The Arctic's transformation is not a headline-grabbing crisis, but a structural expansion of where and how trade happens. With every season that brings more open water, the scramble for access and resources grows sharper. The next chapter will test how nations and companies compete in a frontier where the rules are still being written. In the Arctic, the contest for territory and resources is unfolding without a clear referee. Over the past decade, Russia, Canada, and Denmark have all submitted overlapping claims to the United Nations, each seeking to extend their exclusive economic zones deep into the high north. Russia's 2022 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea filing covers roughly 150,000 square kilometers, while Canada and Denmark have staked claims over areas of 200,000 and 180,000 square kilometers respectively, much of it beneath the melting ice between the Barents Sea and the Beaufort Sea. The legal process is slow, and the boundaries remain unresolved, leaving the region in a state of legal uncertainty. This ambiguity is not just a matter of lines on a map. The Arctic is believed to hold about 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and nearly a third of its natural gas. As the ice recedes, these reserves are becoming more accessible, drawing in state-owned energy firms and private companies eager to secure extraction rights. In recent years, rare earth mineral prospects in Greenland have attracted global attention, prompting new rounds of diplomatic outreach and in 2019 even a high-profile expression of interest from the United States in purchasing Greenland outright. The island's vast mineral deposits, including rare earths critical for electronics and defense, have become a strategic prize in their own right. The stakes are growing as more actors enter the field. Russian coastal defense units now number around 30,000 personnel, while Canada and Denmark have stepped up joint patrols and NATO exercises in Arctic waters. Yet with no final ruling from the United Nations and no established mechanism for resolving disputes, each country operates in a legal gray zone. Resource companies must navigate a patchwork of national laws and shifting diplomatic signals, knowing that any misstep could trigger a broader confrontation. In the absence of a single authority to enforce boundaries or mediate claims, the Arctic is becoming a laboratory for the world's new power politics, one where the rules are still being written and the risks of miscalculation are rising. The next phase will reveal how far states are willing to go to defend their claims when the legal and diplomatic ground remains so uncertain. Power is no longer concentrated. It is distributed, recalibrated, and contested on every front, from trade routes to digital infrastructure. As established rules erode, states improvise and rivals test boundaries, driving volatility into the core of the global system. The real risk is not chaos, but the absence of shared guardrails. Every unresolved crisis now sets the template for the next. In this new era, what is unsettled today becomes tomorrow's reality. Let me know your perspective in the comments.